live on Facebook still or no?
We should be live again. You might need to find us again. I have hit the live button. This is what happens when you lose the internet in the middle of the show, right?
Right, right. Or when you have a cheap laptop and you need to upgrade. So,
Okay, I do see us. I'm going to try to share it out and I'll tag you too. All right, so
okay. And I'll reshare that again.
yeah. All right, so I'm sharing it out live. We'll do it live. Okay. So welcome back, everybody, to episode 22 of Culture Goes Pop. And this week, this was Scott's idea, and I love it. But since it's almost Halloween, we're going to talk about the movies that scared us. You want to kick it off for us, Scott?
Oh, sure, I will kick it off. I don't necessarily have a list, but these things are so vivid in my mind. So vivid in my mind that I can pretty much pull them out of a hat. For me, at the top of the list would have to be The Exorcist. That would
It's on my list.
Yeah, that would have to be The Exorcist. The first time I encountered that film, I used to hear about it as a kid when I was 8 years old. WPIX Channel 11 in New York was broadcasting it on a Sunday night. And they ran advertisements for it. And in this particular advertisement they were running, they introduced me at 8 years old to a full look at the makeup that Dick Smith did for Regan when she is possessed. Regan, played by Linda Blair. I saw that makeup and it scarred me very badly, to the point where even when I see photos of that makeup now or shots from the film, I get a little jolt of adrenaline. I'm not proud to say that as a 45-year-old man, but that's where it is. I didn't see the film itself in its entirety until I was about maybe, I think I was like 21 when I first saw it in its entirety. For me, it lived up to the reputation. It's a nerve-wracking film, very, very well made, a really good story. I mean, to me, that is the granddaddy of all horror films. It was nominated for Best Picture. It's nominated for multiple Academy Awards, it's not usual for the horror genre, and it was especially not usual back in the early 70s.
Right.
But yeah, the Exorcist for me is at the very tip top. How about you, Steve?
Yeah, if I had a top 10, it would be number one in the top 10 of scary movies for a lot of reasons. Most of the reasons, like what you said, the subject matter that we're dealing with a demonic possession. So a lot of horror movies are just some dude, right? You got like your Freddy Kruegers, your Jasons, your Michael Myers, like the guys with the knives or the chainsaws or whatever it is. So you just got a psychopathic, mortal human being, or in some of those cases, not necessarily mortal. But anyways, you get my drift. It's based on a human being that walks among us. Whereas now we're dealing with the devil. We're dealing with something demonic. This whole idea of the possession, the fact that Linda Blair was basically like a school-age girl who was possessed, and the things that are coming out of her mouth, pun intended, not only the language where she is cursing and screaming at everybody, but the pea soup vomit, the spinning of the head, the rising up above the bed. These were some scary, scary things. And much like you, I did not see the movie when it first came out, because it came out in The Exorcist came out in 1973. So I was literally like in probably kindergarten or first grade when that movie came out. So I would have been too young to see it, but everybody knew about it. Not only that, but Linda Blair came on Saturday Night Live and kind of did some sketches where she reprised her character being possessed again, so everybody knew about the movie. I didn't see the movie until probably late 80s when I had my own home video VCR setup where I could watch it at home. That's when I saw The Exorcist on VHS. And even then, at that point, I'm late teens. I was still in suspense and disturbed by watching that movie.
Yes, I actually got a chance to see it on the big screen the same year. Well, no, actually 2 years later from when I saw it for the first time. And many people will remember this, Star Wars, the original trilogy, was re-released as the special editions back in 1997.
Right.
And that started for a few years a trend of re-releasing old classics, and that was common, I think, in decades prior. That was from Disney re-releasing certain cartoons, and a hit movie would stay in theaters for years, up until I think the 1980s or 90s. So I remember they re-released The Exorcist as the version you'd never seen before, where the director William Friedkin added in some shots that were taken out of the original, like the spider walk scene, which had become infamous among fans.
Oh, where she's like walking on the ceiling.
Yeah, on the stair, down the stairs, but she was
Okay,
doing sort
but
of
yeah, like kind of like bent over backwards, walking like a
a
spider.
crab walk.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the crab. Oh yeah, that was
Yeah,
freaky.
that was never in the original film because Friedkin was not happy with the way the effect came out, so he decided not to use it. But he reinserted it with some CGI blood effects and some light effects
Okay.
added in. He also added a few CGI flourishes that I don't think were that much necessary and extended some scenes longer than they should have gone. But I went with a friend of mine who had never seen The Exorcist, and that was a nerve wracking experience in a theater with people. And most of these people, I think, were fans because they were laughing through a lot of it.
Okay, kind of like the Rocky Horror Picture Show at this point, right?
Yeah. Although there was a few parts they did not laugh at. The infamous crucifix masturbation scene.
Oh, that was
Pe-
horrible.
I remember people in the audience, they were laughing at first, and then when they showed where she was
No,
stabbing herself with the
that was
crucifix,
just downright disturbing.
yeah, and then everybody in the audience, you could hear people go, "Oh," and it's just, yeah. There was a couple sitting in front of me and my friend. Uh, the guy had seen. They were in their early 20s. The guy had seen The Exorcist. The girlfriend had not. And then by the end of the movie, she was totally freaked out. She was visibly shaken, and she was like, "Oh my god, I can't believe I just sat through that." So, I think it's also become a movie where its reputation as the scariest movie ever kind of works against it in a way, because now people go into it, "Oh, this is the scariest movie ever. Show me what you got."
Right,
Inst- Instead
right.
of just experiencing it and accepting it on its own terms. But to me, it's still very effective, and it's important to say there's bad language in the film. Yes, there's some very disturbing moments. There's not really a lot of graphic violence. There's not really a lot of gore. There's not
Not
really
a
any
right.
gore.
Not a lot of gore. There's the makeup effects where her face looks scary and things like that. There's the the vomit, the projectile vomiting, things like that. Yeah. So I think a great question when we talk about horror movies and what scares you. For you, Scott, what makes a movie scary? Is it the violence? Is it the seeing the blood and the slashing, or is it something else?
For me, it's something else. I think it's more about a story well told, being able to gradually ratchet up tension. Violence and gore are shocking, but in and of themselves, they're not scary. They can be scary depending on how they are used in a story. But the original Halloween, which I didn't see that until I was an adult, so it didn't scare me as a child. But I find that to be not necessarily a scary film, but a very suspenseful film. There's not a lot of violence in that. Just like The Exorcist, most of what you think of when you think of Halloween and The Exorcist is what happens in the third act of those films. Most of the stuff in The Exorcist that you identify with when you think of that film happens in the last 20 minutes. Halloween, most of the stuff that you think of when you think of Michael Myers happens in the last 20 minutes of that film. Up until then, it's been ratcheting up tension, it's been story, it's been character building. And
Right.
so it's sort of like the horror is just sort of the icing on the cake. That's like the money shot, you know.
Right. Yeah. So for me, the things that scare me are not always visual. It's more of the suspense. It's the unknown. Like you say, it's the tension. And if anything else, a lot of times you can have, and this is a classic movie trope as well, where they're starting to build the suspense and then they'll have the jump scare where it's like a cat will jump out real quick and you're like, oh, because they built everything up, but that was the misdirect. That wasn't the big thing. But when you've done a good job building suspense, something that doesn't cost a lot of money to do with special effects can still scare you because it's the climax to the build, right? And so to me, what scares me is not just blood and guts. It is the way the story's crafted, the way this the things you don't see, and the things you're the you know the intensity that's building. If the story is done well, is what to me what builds the fear factor for me. You know.
Yeah, well, that's I think William Peter. I mean, not William Peter Blatty. He wrote the book The Exorcist that was the basis for the film. But the director William Friedkin, he came from a background of documentaries, so he knew how to sort of film things in a very matter of fact way that made it seem like not so much that you were watching a movie, but you were watching something that was actually occurring. Like he just happened to be there to capture footage of an exorcism, and you're just sort of a fly on the wall watching what happens to this little girl as these priests do battle with a demon that's inside her.
Right.
And his other films that he did in the 70s, like uh Sorcerer, like The French Connection, those also have documentary qualities that make them feel very gritty and make you almost forget that you're watching a production.
Right.
So
And later on, the documentary thing you were referring to became almost a style of the found footage films,
yeah,
which the Blair Witch Project made famous, and then something like Cloverfield. So there's been a few that have come out in the 21st century that when you mentioned the word documentary, it made me think of this newer genre of found footage things where they make a story based on supposedly showing us footage they found, and and then the horror reveals itself from there. I think that's an interesting take on it, but that's what that made me think of. Since there's probably more than two or three that we want to talk about, do we want to move on to another movie and we'll
well,
start to
well
build a list?
I'll move on to a list. Well, here for my next entry is going to be the early filmography of a certain filmmaker who I love, who happens to be my very favorite. But
Okay.
when I was a child, I was quite frightened by the films of Steven Spielberg.
Okay.
I will give the first example I will give is not and here's the thing: when you're a kid, it's not just horror films that scare you. That's why I suggested the title of this show not necessarily be the horror films that scared us. It's
But
just
movies,
movies that
movies that
scared
scared
us.
us. Yes.
When I first saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, or the ending to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I found out later on in life I was not alone, that this ending traumatized a lot of people. When Belloc and the Nazis open up the Ark of the Covenant at the end of the film and they have Indy and Marion tied to that post, when they do that, oh my God, when they do that, and when they open up that Ark and those ghosts or spirits jump out of that Ark and start flying around, and then they
Yes.
shoot beams through people, and then you see
Mm-hmm.
Tote, the enforcer guy, you see his face melt, you see a
Yes.
Nazi officer's
Yeah.
face melt,
Yeah.
you see Belloc's face explode. And after you kind of speak your piece, Steve, I'm going to give some trivia about the way this scene was put together and what it did to the film. But when I saw that as a kid, I couldn't watch Raiders in full until I was it came out when I was maybe 4, and I saw a documentary when I was 5 that featured that ending footage, and I couldn't watch the whole movie until I was 9 because of that. And even then, I couldn't watch the ending. Go ahead.
Okay, and what I'm doing is you add your movies. I'm putting them in the scroll down here on the bottom, so we have a running list of things we've talked about. So for people who maybe are watching us live and tune in, so that wasn't on my list of scary movies, but I agree with you. That was a frightening scene. So let me just ask you this now: what made it scary to you? Was it the visual element of the ghosts and the god rays and the melting and the exploding, or was there other tension that was also built up leading to that story wise?
It was both because, like I said before, Spielberg is one of my favorites. Now, Spielberg, back then, he was considered to be the Peter Pan of cinema. He was considered to be the kid that never grew up, and his movies
Okay.
appealed to kids and families. But
Right.
I always thought that was funny, given that his early films, Jaws, Close Encounters, Raiders,
Mm-hmm.
E.T., and he was also a producer on Poltergeist, and there's a controversy as to whether or not he directed most of that film or was it Tobe Hooper. If you look at all those films I just mentioned, they all have pronounced horror elements, and
Yes.
and they are all. Whereas The Exorcist is really, it's not really as violent as you remember.
Hmm.
Those Spielberg movies are a little more violent than people remember and give credit
Interesting.
for. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
and that melting scene in Raiders, that freaked me out because just
Yeah.
the I wasn't expecting it. But again, that's to Spielberg's credit. Again, it's how you use gore and violence. You're not
Right.
necessarily expecting it in this kind of film, and then he pulls that on you. But
Right.
he had to. Raiders was originally rated PG, and that scene at the end, the MPAA was originally going to give it an R
Wow.
because, yeah, if you look at the visual of Belloc's face exploding, there's a pillar of fire, there's a layer of fire in front of it. Originally there was no layer of fire, it was just the makeup effect of the head and
Okay.
hands exploding. the
Okay.
MP, the MPAA saw that and they say, look, we're gonna have to give you an R, especially when you got the Nazi mechanic getting chopped up by the propeller of the airplane. So we're gonna have to, so Steven and everybody, they added a layer of fire in front of it to obscure the visual.
Okay. To soften it a bit. You still knew what was happening, but it
Yeah.
wasn't. It wasn't as pronounced.
And he was threatened with an R for Jaws as well, because if you've seen Jaws lately, that's rated PG.
Okay.
I defy anybody. You grew up during the 70s. You were a kid
Yep.
during the 70s. I wasn't born until 77. Go back and look at Jaws when you have some time, and look at certain key scenes, and tell me if you think that film would get a PG now.
No, absolutely not. No, no. There's like the guy's leg is sinking to the bottom. You
Thank you,
see,
thank you.
you see, the guy sliding down the boat into his mouth, and already in his mouth, you see another diver in the shark's mouth. So you see other
Right.
carnage in his gullet, if you will. Um, no, but speaking of what we were talking about earlier, what makes a movie scary? What made Jaws so scary was that you didn't see the
See the
shark
shark.
most of the time. So it was the tension building of the fear of the unknown of what you can't see. You knew he
Right.
was out there, but you didn't see him. And part of that was just if you've ever listened to any of the behind the scenes stuff, it had to do with budgeting and logistics where they couldn't get, and that
The
shark's
shark
name
to
was,
work.
yeah, Bruce.
Bruce.
Yeah, Bruce.
Thinking,
They couldn't even get him there in time. So you only have so much time to make the movie. So he filmed everything he could film that didn't require a shark, and had to do some artistic and creative things to maybe just show the fin or to show this. But yeah, so it was just circumstances that made the shark not as available during most of the principal photography, that forced him to have to work on the suspense angle, which actually works. So like you say, when you do see it, it's a payoff, right? It's not
yes.
gratuitous. It's not over the top, right? And that worked
Yes.
out very well.
Right. And like I said, Spielberg, that's why he's one of my favorites. That guy has always been a little bit more devilish than people give him credit for. And like, look at his early films and you'll see what I'm talking about. He allows his horns to show, but there's also something so warm about some of his films that you kind of forget that there are clearly moments where he allows his id to come out and play.
Sure.
So I don't know what I don't want this to all be my
No,
picks.
that's fine. I will add mine as well, but I'm going to go through here. So I'm going to go back one in between The Exorcist. So my list, the top two. Number one was The Exorcist. Number two was The Shining,
Ah,
which is that Stanley Kubrick who
Stanley
directed
Kubrick.
that, right?
Yes, based on a
So
Stephen King novel.
right. So that's in my top 10. And most of my horror movies are not only because I'm old, but I don't know. I've lost my taste for modern horror, although I have seen some of the newer, scarier movies. To me, they lack a lot of the soul and a lot of the suspense and kind of, building momentum type stuff. That aspect is mostly lost, I feel. So most of my lists are going to be movies that were made between the 70s and the 80s. Not just because I'm old, just because it's kind of like music, it just hasn't gotten much better since then.
Well,
So a lot of the modern scary movies are just not my cup of tea. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and add to the list The Exorcist and The Shining. The Shining, I saw again. I was probably not of the proper age to see this in the theater, but I believe I saw it on cable TV. And And for me to even do that, I had to like spend the night at a friend's house to watch cool movies because my parents wouldn't let me stay up late and they wouldn't let me watch anything cool on TV that was not age appropriate. So
Right.
I'm pretty sure I saw The Shining during a sleepover at a friend's house on cable on a probably fairly small, like maybe 13-inch TV in some kid's bedroom, but it was still scary as all hell watching this movie with everything from just a creepy mood, being in this resort with nobody there, and the kid running around seeing the two twin girls,
Mm-hmm.
the red rum stuff, him talking with his finger, the wife, how Jack just starts to slowly go crazy, the famous "Here's Johnny" scene. Here's Johnny. There's just so many moments that are the big kind of punches, the big climaxes to certain tension building things. But as a whole, the movie was just weird, this kind of dark
Right.
and scary, and especially if you're watching it as a younger person. But even now watching it, there's just a element of just, there's a creep factor to it that's by design. you know
It's that film. It's all in the with that film. It's all in the atmosphere. It's like, to be honest, most of the time I wasn't even sure when I first saw it. I didn't even really know what I was watching. I was like, "What is this?" But it's just like as time goes, those visuals that Stanley kind of came up with, and some of those shots, he was notorious for. He would drive actors crazy because he would do take after take after take after take until the actors were just like they were just blank. They like, but just yeah, the visuals in that film, and just the way he disorients you, like you really you get the feeling it's like the maze of the hotel itself and the garden maze outside. You get a feeling of not knowing where you are. The longer you watch that film, you really feel like you
right,
don't know where you
right.
are.
And you're slowly peeling back the layers of Jack's sanity as he's having conversations with the bartender and some of the previous people who held his job there and stuff. So he's having these conversations and he's meeting these people and he's talking to these people that aren't there. Those are things I don't know that I picked up on as a kid when I watched it on cable, but watching it again recently, just seeing some of there's just so many pieces of, I'm just going to use the word creepy. There's so many creepy things about Jack and his sanity and his history within that world, because apparently, he's kind of been like the caretaker of that thing forever and just kind of reincarnated over and over again. That was kind of creepy. So yeah, there was this. It was well done suspense horror. When it did have a big moment, it was a payoff, right? So like him chopping through the door with the hatchet was a payoff. The big blood coming down the hallways was a big scary moment. So a lot of those moments when you did see something kind of special effecty or kind of graphic, it wasn't gratuitous. It was like the punchline to a good joke. You have a setup and a punchline. It was the payoff to something that was leading to that. So everything felt it was done at the right time.
Yes, it was. It definitely was. I mean, The Shining. That's another one. I didn't get to see that until in full until my senior year in high school. I rented it just off of a friend's recommendation because he noticed that I liked like other Kubrick films like A Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket, and he was like, you should check this out. I'd always heard about it as a kid, like
Right.
about how scary it was, and everybody knows the "Here's Johnny" and all that stuff. But yeah, and I watched it, and I was just I was kind of a little too old to really be shaken up by it at that point. But I was more fascinated with just the filmmaking and just how it's just this, like you said, this slow descent into this guy
Yeah.
going crazy and becoming a danger to his family. And all those were very original to me at the time that I saw it. I was
Yeah.
like, wow, I've never seen a horror film quite like. And then you got Scatman Carruthers,
Yeah.
sort of explaining the idea of The Shining, what that term means. Yeah, it's just a very, very unique horror film. Very unique.
Okay. So let's go on to another pick. We'll toss it back and forth.
Okay, another pick would be, for me, a film that initially scared the crap out of me at the age of 11, but I soon became obsessed with its lead character or lead monster, I'm gonna let you guess as to what that film was.
Is it The Thing?
No, it's a
Lead
slasher
character?
movie. Slasher movie.
Okay, Friday the 13th.
Close.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street. All my friends were watching Freddy movies when I was around 10 and 11 years old. My mother, who was always very strict in terms of certain things that, not everything, but certain things, like R-rated horror movies. She didn't like slasher films at all. She thought they were disgusting. She thought that they uh, taught kids bad values. She thought they radiated with negative energy. And I'm not sure she was wrong about all of that either.
All right.
But I remember just seeing pictures of Freddy and seeing the clawed glove. And the funny thing was, I didn't find Freddy himself scary. I was intrigued by the glove and this burned up guy, and just as a kid, something about that just spoke to my imagination. So I tried to tape Nightmare on Elm Street off of network television one night, and it came to that shot where the upside down thing where Tina is getting slashed to bits, to ribbons by Freddy, and he's dragging her on the ceiling while her boyfriend is just sitting there in his underwear, just scared into just not even moving. All he can do is watch and scream. And I
Yeah.
remember I came home and I turned that scene on, and I got so flustered and just so frightened that I dropped the remote, and my mother saw my reaction, so she stopped the VCR. She said, "Okay, you're not going to be watching that." And then a few months later, I got my courage up, and my older cousin Corey, he sat me down. He said, "Look, you're going to watch this, and you're going to get over that." And I watched it. The film creeped me the hell out at 11 years old. It really did. But it didn't. It's funny, as uncomfortable as I was watching it, and even I couldn't sleep the night afterward, it didn't stop my fascination with Freddy. I was still fascinated with this guy. So, and that began a love affair with the character. I mean,
Yes.
the actor Robert Englund,
Robert Englund. Yes.
yes. So, but go ahead.
So here's some, again, I'm not a film scholar or historian or an expert in any way, but I have my kind of opinions and philosophies on a few things that may or may not be true or possibly ring true. But what we were looking at in the 80s was kind of a reboot of modern horror. So while Halloween was probably late 70s, I believe Halloween kind of still was on the cusp of the 80s. So you had something like Halloween, which was a modern scary movie. Then you had um, uh, what's the one with Jason Voorhees? Friday the 13th,
Yes.
right? A modern thriller. But what do Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees both have in common? Well, they have a mask and they don't speak. So the slow, silent, stalking type is scary. But what was unique about Freddy Krueger? He was a bad guy who had a persona. And he had a sense of humor, and it was a dark, twisted sense of humor because he was an evil SOB who was killing people.
Yes.
Um, and he reveled in that. He took pleasure in the torment he did. Not only did he just kill them as graphic, gratuitous violence, but he did it in their dreams, in their nightmares. So he killed them in their sleep. And so it got to the point where people are afraid to fall asleep because they know if I do sleep, as the song says, 1 and 2, Freddy's coming for you, right? 3 and 4, better lock your door. 5 and 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again, right? That's the song, which I haven't forgotten since God knows when. But you're so afraid that you literally don't want to go to sleep because this is like the whole thing, like, oh my God, Dad, there's a monster under my bed, or I'm afraid to go to sleep because I'm having nightmares. Well, if you go to sleep, not only are you going to have a nightmare, but that nightmare is going to kill you for reals, right? So when you think about that, if that was a real thing, that is literally frightening to the people who feel like they're on that list, right? So that idea was a new twist on horror. And Freddy Krueger was a new twist on the horror villain. I don't think they realized at the time he would become a franchise. I think they just made this movie hoping to make a good movie. Um, I think obviously the first one is the best. I think Nightmare 2 is probably forgettable because I know I've seen it and I don't remember seeing it. But Nightmare 3 is probably the most memorable because that was the big blockbuster version of that. Um, but yeah, Freddy Krueger is still an infamous horror character from the kind of new wave of 80s horror. that's still popular today. So I would agree with you. But it's not only was it over the top, graphically violent, but I believe the suspense and intrigue were still there as well.
Right. And funny thing is, if you look at the films, keep in mind his original victims were children. He was a child killer in the original films.
Right, his backstory.
But there's a element that was taken away, or that Wes Craven, the creator and director and writer, that he de-emphasized, and for market, the purposes of marketing the film and helping it find an audience. In his original story, Freddy Krueger was not just a child killer, but a child molester.
Ah,
But he realized, with all of the other elements in the film, sex, graphic violence,
yeah, that's
gore,
too much.
and then if you add that in there, he was pretty sure the MPAA will not only will we're going to get an R anyway, they're going to deny us an R,
Wow.
and
Okay.
we'll either have to accept an X or release the film unrated, which kills its chances. Either one of those kind of diminishes its chances in the marketplace.
Right.
So he was just a child killer. But his original, in the remake, I don't know if you ever saw the Platinum Dunes remake, they play up the molestation part, and it
Okay.
kind of it really, that remake is not a good movie. It's not horrible though, but that molestation part really does kind of bring it, I'd argue it turns it from horror and slasher into something else.
Okay.
You know, like it sort of brings in an element that I think you can't have fun with it the way you had fun with the original.
Right. Right. Because he was kind of a personality. Freddy Krueger was a character. He is a character. Became, just the character of Freddy Krueger just became larger than life because of who he was, how he looked, how he did things, his kind of Schwarzenegger-esque quips, his little lines before and after he killed people, things like that. Yeah, I would definitely say the first one filled the bill of a movie that scared you. Even though there was over the top gratuitous violence, it still had an element, still had a good fear factor for it.
Right, definitely. You know, and it's also, if you watch it now, it's very much a B movie. The acting in that thing, aside from England, is not that great. The chick that played Nancy, I can't remember her name. It's
Yeah.
just not that great, but the movie is still very entertaining.
Right, and they were all pretty much relative unknowns, where Robert Englund wasn't that well known either. But Johnny Depp did get his kind of early start too. Johnny Depp was the boyfriend who had the headphones on, who was watching TV in his bedroom, and I think he got killed too. But
Yeah,
before there was a 21 Jump Street and anybody knew who Johnny Depp was, he was like in the Friday the 13th, one of the camp kids who ends up getting killed by Jason, right? He was killed by Freddy Krueger. So
that was with the blood pouring out of the bed and reaching up to the ceiling, the anti-gravity scene, which if you look at the very end of it, you'll see that fountain of blood spring up to the top sort of starts to curve at the top, and that's because it was filmed in a rotating room, and the filmmakers and the experts, they lost control of everything, and the room started to turn and caused a fire, and everybody
oh
had
my
to
goodness.
run. Yeah, almost burned the whole thing down. But yeah, if you watch the movie and watch that shot, you'll see it just starting. You'll see when when the blood starts to turn.
Okay. So in no particular order, I have two on my list that we've now talked about: The Shining and The Exorcist. Um, Friday the 13th, I think, was on my list too, so I'm going to move that down. Raiders of the Lost Ark was not on my list, but I won't disagree with you on that scene. Another thing, and I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, but what was good about the Indiana Jones movies when they were dealing with problems of biblical proportions? And I think the movies that aren't as fan favorites are the ones that kind of got away from the Bible. So when we started dealing with the chakra stones, even though that did
Right.
have kind of a religious element to it, it wasn't biblical, it wasn't Western. And then when we got to the whole crystal skull alien thing, again, the minute we get away from the Bible and we're not dealing with, the wrath of God, the movies, for whatever reason, don't seem to do as well. So the first and the third are going to be the most well loved and remembered of the four movies right now.
Well, actually, there's been sort of a reappraisal in some circles of Temple of Doom, and to the point where I've heard some people, not a lot, say that that's their favorite.
Oh, yeah, I have no shade or judgment to cast on it, but I think just generally, if you know, when you look at public opinion and ratings and all that kind of stuff, I think most of the criticism is the ones that don't deal with the wrath of God are just not as popular.
Right.
For whatever reason. I did like the second one for a lot of reasons. I love the pulling the heart out of the guy's chest and he's still looking at you, you know, all the kid slaves being whooped on and stuff. There was just so many interesting things that were in there. And the video game based on it too was pretty cool. So yeah, I didn't not like that one, but of the first three, it's probably in third place. Whereas number one and number three are my favorite two, and number two is my third favorite. Um, so yeah, what's next on the list? Movies that scared you, Scott Wilson.
Hmm. Okay. There's so many, man. There's so many. So many. I'm trying not to, because I could stay on the Spielberg thing, but I already put that in one tier by itself.
Right.
So I will say,
And we just got a question in the live chat from Lola J saying, "What would you say is the scariest movie of all time?" And this person said that their vote is for The Shining. The Shining is definitely number two in what we've discussed so far. Lola, thanks for joining us. Would you say The Exorcist outshines The Shining for you, Scott?
it does, but I'd say top five for me, and it's interchangeable. The Exorcist. I would also put Night of the Living Dead, the original, up there. I would also put Alien, the
Yeah.
original, up there. I would also put. I
Well,
would.
let's not
I would
get too
actually.
far ahead.
All right. Okay.
But scariest of all time, is it a tie between would you say for you, The Exorcist is number one, scariest of all time?
Yes.
Okay, and I would
Uh,
say it's probably in there, and then the trailing would be The Shining. But everything else that you've mentioned is on my list too, and is movies we will probably be talking about on this episode. Okay, so what have we talked about so far? We've talked about The Exorcist, Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Shining, and Nightmare on Elm Street. What's the next movie that scared you, Scott Wilson?
I'm actually trying to think of it because, to be honest, I was scared of so much as a child that it's like I can't I can't
Okay,
really. It's almost hard to
so
narrow down. But
let me just throw out Halloween then.
let's throw out there. Let's throw that out there.
Okay, the original Halloween with Michael Myers, Jamie Lee Curtis. Uh, Scary movie. It started a franchise, started a legacy. You know, they're still making sequels. There's a reboot, Halloween Ends, that's out right now, both live and streaming. So there's been some legacy sequels. There were some original sequels. I haven't followed the mythology too far or too closely. I just know that Michael Myers is a classic scary villain for all the reasons that I said make him different from Freddy Krueger. Where Freddy Krueger, he has a voice, he talks, he's got a personality. Michael Myers is a face behind a mask, and he doesn't speak. And so I think sometimes that silence and that foreboding and not knowing where he is or when he might strike does build to the suspense. And he, like Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th and like Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, is a guy who seemingly you just can't kill. Where at the end of every movie, we think we've killed him and we think he's dead, but somehow there's going to be another movie and he's not dead, right? So he
Right.
has this kind of immortal element to him. So it's almost like, you know, an unstoppable killing force, which is what was great about Alien and the original Terminator, too. You know, just something that can kill you that you can't kill is literally frightening.
Right. And it's also important to note Halloween was not the first slasher movie. Some people would go back to Black Christmas, which came before Halloween. It was also takes the title for a holiday themed horror film. So it kind of beat Halloween to the punch in those regards. And you also have movies like Peeping Tom and movies like Psycho that could be considered the roots of the slasher genre. But it was Halloween that really popularized the genre and added the trope, I think, of, like you said, the unstoppable killer. And the thing that's great about Halloween is it does not explain why Michael doesn't die. It doesn't explain why he can take a knitting needle to the neck. Spoilers if you haven't seen it. It's a 40 some odd year old film, but you know, a knitting needle to the neck, a butcher knife to the chest, a straightened hanger to the eye, and then 5 or 6 shots point blank range, and then falling out of a window. And then Dr. Loomis looks down at the ground and he's gone. And then the movie just ends with various shots around the neighborhood. And you just hear him breathing on the soundtrack, and then it's over. I just would have loved to have been with an audience in 1978 to see their reaction to that. The,
Right.
the threat is still there. He's not. You didn't stop him. You didn't kill him. He's still out there. Like that. That's just and it. James Cameron took influence from that for the Terminator, and I just every film after that that had an unstoppable killer had to tip its hat to Halloween.
Right. And let's look at, and again, kind of like we mentioned, the original Terminator was kind of like a low budget B movie. Halloween, what was the props? The actual mask that Michael Myers wore was actually a Captain Kirk mask. So that's William Shatner that they basically spray painted white. So his mask is like a Dawn Post Studios rubber Captain Kirk mask, and he wore basically overalls, and he had a freaking chef knife. That was the props. That was the wardrobe. They didn't have to spend a lot of money designing this character. And it's not like Stranger Things now, where there's a $10 trillion visual effects budget to create all the bad guys on the screen, right? This was a low budget, but scary AF,
Yes, I mean, well, John Carpenter, who I think is quietly one of the most influential directors or filmmakers of the last. Let's see, Halloween came out in '78, so that would be 45 years, 45 to 50 years. He had Halloween, he had Escape from New York, he had Big Trouble in Little China, he had The Fog, he
Oh, The
had
Fog. You know what? I should put The Fog on the list too. That was a great movie.
yeah, he had Assault on Precinct 13. He had They Live. He had the remake of The Thing. I mean, and like so many of his films, Halloween has been remade.
Right.
Assault on Precinct 13 got remade. The Fall got remade. I mean, this guy. I think the fact that so much of his work has been remade and reinterpreted by other filmmakers speaks a lot to his talent.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And another thing too, the music is so simple,
Which
but
he,
effective.
which he, com- which he composed.
Right,
He's
right.
a
John
composer.
Carpenter does a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so simple but effective. It's just so primal. It just gets to your nerves. It's like, ooh, gives me the
Yeah.
chills, right? So soundtrack can do a lot for that, right? And that's also when you talk about tension building too. A lot of the tension has to do with other elements that are, the lighting, the mood, the atmosphere, the locations, and the soundtrack, and the kind of atmospheric soundtrack or orchestral, whatever it may be. But all of those elements lead into building the environment of fear in these films, if done well. And you can't always put your finger on what's the one thing that's making it scary. It's almost like it's the perfect storm of all these ingredients together just made it taste better than it could have been. But yeah, Halloween definitely be on that list. Again, kind of launching a franchise. It just became bigger than anybody ever expected it to be. And again, there's a brand new legacy sequel out now for those who are fans of that iconic title.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's been remade. You had the Rob Zombie remake. You had Halloween 2018, but none of them are as effective as that original article. None of them, it's
Right.
that's still the blueprint for slasher films. That's still, you know, duplicated but never, never equaled, never topped. I just love that movie. That's one of the rare perfect films. And again, that was a B movie. That was a
Right.
B
Right.
movie through and through. But it's just the way it's shot. The score by Carpenter himself. the the way Michael Myers is the way he's conceptualized and executed. I mean, I can't think of
Right. It's
anything
it's
else
one
more
of
to
those
say.
cases where less is more. Right. You didn't spend a
Right.
lot of money on it, but they okay. So here's a great question from Lola J live watching us on YouTube right now. Can you remember the first horror movie you ever saw?
I can. I think it was either the creature from the Black Lagoon or An American Werewolf in London, which I didn't see all of, but I just remember as a kid it being repeated on HBO a lot, so I saw certain scenes from it, and I was way. There's no way a kid should be watching that movie.
Right, right. So for me, the early horror movies I saw were on TV, back in the 70s. And these were movies that were made probably in the 30s or 40s or even 50s. But there used to be on the local channel something that was called Creature Feature. And on the weekends, they would just show scary movies from that were old back then. So a lot of the Universal horror movies like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Holy Trilogy there. Um, a lot of those things, a lot of B movies that were like 1950s sci-fi B movies. So I remember seeing a lot of those back in the day, and part of the reason why it was harder for me to be scared even as a kid is because even though this was on normal television, my parents were so worried about me being scared that they ruined any illusion for me by saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. That's just a man in makeup, and that's just special effects, and that's trick photography, and that's makeup." And so they kind of ruined. On the one hand, they ruined the movies for me, but on the other hand, they've given me a lifelong fascination on
Right.
how movies are made. What's the magic behind the camera that puts the magic on the camera. So yeah, my horror movies I saw early as a kid were like the early from like 1930s to 1960s horror
Yeah.
and sci-fi stuff on television. Um, so that hopefully that answers your question, Lola.
There's one movie I'd like to add to the. I don't know how we're doing on runtime at the
Oh, I
moment.
don't know. It doesn't matter. We've been about 47 minutes.
Okay, so
so, but
there's
that's
one.
okay.
There's one I'd like to add to the list, and this will be the last one. And this
Okay.
is definitely a horror film in the true sense of the word. It's David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly with Jeff
Okay, the one with Jeff Goldblum.
and Gina Davis.
Okay.
Again, I saw that when I was like about 10. I was way too young. My father ordered it off a pay per view, and I guess at that point, adults. Now that I'm around the same age that my father was when he showed me that film, I can say that adults aren't always too savvy to certain things.
Okay.
When they show them to kids, they don't realize that when he was thinking of The Fly with Vincent Price,
Right.
the original, and he's probably still thinking along those lines. And I think he wasn't savvy enough at the time to realize that, look, an 80s remake of that is not going to be the same thing that you saw, because horror means something different in 1986 than it meant in 1950 whatever. The notion of what audiences consider to be horrifying is way different. So he watched it first, and he figured, okay, if he just kind of gave me some warnings of when to close my eyes, I'd be okay. And that didn't work. That movie was my introduction to serious makeup effects in terms of gore and monsters and what have you. And just that image of just Jeff Goldblum's gradual decay and
Yes.
transformation into this sort of fly insect hybrid, human hybrid, was
Yeah.
just that scarred me so much. Like, I can't ever really forget that. Like, I can't forget how the effect that had on me. And just like, now it's a great movie. Now I watch it over and over.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's
Yeah, it was literally and utterly disturbing at the time for all of the right reasons. The subject matter and the makeup and special effects that we saw. The kind of transmutation from human to hybrid to God knows what it was. In the end, it's a giant human-sized fly, right? The fact that he was mostly consciously aware of this at the time, and Lola J says Jeff is the man and he's still a babe. And yeah, Jeff Goldblum is one of my more favorite actors. And when you think about the character he played, this kind of eccentric scientist who was kind of like a closeted scientist. He's working in this kind of warehouse abandoned facility out in the middle of nowhere, and all of these projects that he's trying to do, and that personality that he brought through, that carried over in so many more roles, like him playing Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, and him playing the guy who was in the Independence Day. So that kind of cool, crazy scientisty type guy, he kind of got pigeonholed in that in a lot of roles, but it worked well. He did it really good, I feel. He's a good-looking guy. He's not too good-looking where the average guy is going to be disgusted by him. He's not like a Brad Pitt good-looking, but he is, he's a decent-looking guy who's physically fit and has a really quirky personality. So the ladies can like him, the guys can like him and not feel too offended by him. And he does a lot of roles really well.
Yes, Jeff Goldblum is another 70s horror flick that I just in the last few months saw for the first time that he's in, that's very effective, called it's the Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake from 1978, and it's him, Leonard
Yes.
Nimoy,
Yeah,
and
that's on my list.
Donald Sutherland.
Donald Sutherland.
And that film isn't really gory, but some of the images are still nonetheless disturbing.
Absolutely.
There's a scene in that movie, spoilers for anybody who hasn't, again, a movie from 1978. There's a scene where, while he's sleeping on his front lawn, and those pods reach their tentacles out to him and they start to duplicate him right in front of your eyes, and you see his clone, his pod being hatched. And even me now at 45 years old, it's not gory, it's disgusting, but it's not
it's
gory.
Disturbing.
Yeah, but it's just to watch that, just the way it's envisioned, is just eerie. Very eerie.
Your phone? I keep hearing a dinging sound. Is that your phone that keeps dinging? Because I thought I turned my ringer off. Maybe I didn't.
Actually, I think it might be. Hold on, let me
turn
that off.
Because every time I hear that ding, I'm looking down at my phone to see if it's me.
I gotta turn it off.
Messing with me. No, absolutely. It was and what I did like about The Fly, which was late '80s, early, not quite the '90s, but if you want to do a reimagining of this, what better way than to use the concept of teleportation and gene splicing? Which are, teleportation is still science fiction. We're not there. Scotty cannot beam us up, but he was trying to figure out how to teleport because he had a problem with motion sickness, right? His character, he didn't like being in the car. He didn't like flying. So he wanted his gift to the world was going to be a way for people to travel without having to deal with the time, the distance, or the possible motion sickness. So the fact that he was trying to create these teleportation chambers and testing that on, starting with a fruit and then going to a baboon and then going on and testing it on himself, was really interesting. And how the fly got in the chamber and the computer didn't know what to do with it, so it became a gene splicer. These concepts were so far out of left field to bring semi-science fact into this sci-fi horror thing. I thought was really imaginative and well done, especially for the time,
Right. It kind of, I think, really defined body horror for a lot of guys my age. It really defined that subgenre of horror, and it really kind of, as a kid, that was my introduction to Cronenberg, this guy has a whole library full of disturbing films. This guy, if you just look at his filmography, he specializes in stuff that just messes your mind up. But he's very good at it. He's amazing at it. And I think The Fly is one of the very best remakes of all time. I think if you had to do a countdown of that, it's one of the very completely reimagines the original and sort of turns it into something, I think, much bigger than it was. Or turns it into something much bigger than it was originally conceived to be. It uses a basic idea and then builds on top of that and comes up with something that you feel like you've never seen before. That's not a very easy thing to do. Not
Right,
very
right,
easy.
right.
Not very easy.
Absolutely.
But honestly, that would be, just to keep things nice and neat. That would be my final entry. I mean, because we could go on, like I said, we could go on with this for days and nights
Right,
and
right,
weeks.
right, right, right. So rather than me putting a lot of stuff here on the scroll and on the teleprompter for the screen, I'm just going to go over a few on the list. Some of these that we talked about in passing, but The Fog was another one that was pretty suspense based. And again, it's all about, like with the original Jaws movie, what you don't see. The just knowing that there's these kind of ghost pirates out there that are cursed and that they may or may not, kill the whole town when when the fog reaches the ground is a scary concept. The original Psycho, Norman Bates, 1960, scary movie. You know what I mean? So that's on my list. American Werewolf in London is a great reimagining of the werewolf concept, because my exposure to the
Yes.
Wolfman was Lon Chaney Jr.'s The Wolfman in 1934. You know what I mean? So he was a guy in a costume. He still had most of his costume. Of course, he had the furry hands, feet, and face, so it was all makeup, but he was still a vertically upright, bipedal human with a wolf face. American Werewolf in London, he actually transforms into a wolf. And it was all using practical effects and makeup. And the fact that his face started stretching and his hands were stretching out into claws, and you could sense this guy was in an amazing amount of pain as his body was being ripped and stretched into all these different things. The world had never seen anything like that. So that was landmark breakout visual special effects. Now I wouldn't call them visual effects, but special effects, makeup effects, practical effects. We hadn't seen that. The fact, and the whole idea behind a werewolf is usually you get attacked by a werewolf, but you survive, right? Because usually the werewolf will kill you and eat you. If you survive a werewolf attack, then
You
you are
become one.
cursed. And that goes back to Lon Chaney's Jr., the Wolfman in 1933. So that's what happened to him, but the transformation is much more horrific. And the fact that now everybody he kills, he sees. And they're kind of like ghosts that haunt him. And his best friend, who he kills, continues to decay through the movie. He's sitting down in a movie theater talking, and his friend's talking to him, and like you can see just like pieces of skin hanging down, and his jaws exposed, and all of this stuff that everybody he kills stays with him and haunts him forever. The stuff that this thing had not seen before.
And there's a lot of humor in that movie.
Yeah.
A lot of That's also what made it stand out at the time was, and I think this was sort of a part of like this new approach that the filmmakers of the 70s, John Landis is the one who directed that, and I think that's part of this sort of new approach to old material, is you sort of add this sort of, what's the word for it, disarming sense of humor. Because on the one hand you have these scenes that are making you jump out of your skin, and then on the other hand you have some scenes of, frankly, sometimes very raunchy humor. I remember the lead of that film. There's one scene where basically he's changed back into a human, and he's at a zoo. He wakes up in a zoo, and he's completely naked, and he has to climb out of that cage, and then he has to steal some balloons from a little kid, and like you know
Right.
try to get
Right.
back home. But it's just a disarming sense of humor, and that amazing attention to detail with the transformation effects. And there's also a kind of a nightmare quality to the movie, because there are scenes that sort of play with, is he just dreaming this, is it real, is he crazy? It's a very odd film in a good way. That's how I think of
Yeah.
American Werewolf in London. A very weird, odd movie, but in a good way.
Okay. We did have another question from Lola J, but what was the question that Lola asked us? Why do you think horror films rarely make it to movie award shows like the Oscars and SAG? But you had mentioned a few that actually did. So why don't we go over the ones that have been awarded?
Well, let me answer that question if I can. I mean, from what I've seen, and I'm not a scholar on this, there's probably a million people that can answer this better than me. But genre films in general I think the Academy is oftentimes very slow to recognize genre films. Uh, Sci-fi again was mostly seen as sort of a junky genre for kids until Star Wars came along, and even then, Star Wars is still kind of derided in some circles for being essentially a kids movie or an expensive B movie. You know, action films don't do too well with the Academy. Um, yeah, I think Raiders of the Lost Ark is probably one of the few action adventure movies that was ever nominated for Best Picture. Horror is still not a quote unquote respectable genre in the eyes of the peanut gallery to an
Okay.
extent. But I mean, but you do have The Exorcist, you do have The Sixth Sense that was nominated for Best Picture, you do have Jaws that was nominated for Best Picture, you do have The Silence of the Lambs, which won Best Picture.
Right. And Phantom 8-Bit Bitter is saying that American Werewolf in London won 2 Oscars and had 2 more nominations. So that's
Yes,
another one there.
on the technical side, yes.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that most of these Academy Award type things are really looking for things that would appear in the Cannes Film Festival. They're looking for artsy things, drama things. They're looking for
Yes,
stuff that where we can give another trophy to somebody like Meryl Streep. That's what it's always been about: is old Hollywood wanting to basically, reward more of old Hollywood is what a lot of that felt like. That's why you needed things like, basically the MTV Movie Awards was where all the cool kids voted on the really cool movies. And unfortunately, Twilight dominated that for a decade, it seems like,
right,
which I won't even get into Twilight being a good horror film. But, Twilight kind of reinvigorated and almost reimagined the romantic vampire stuff, which is still going on forever. And there's so many romantic vampire genre films and episodic stuff on TV still, which I would say the original romantic vampire had to have been one of, well, if you let's rewind that. When you really want to talk about a romantic vampire, even going back to Dracula, the original Dracula, he kind of was a hopeless romantic, right? So so Dracula was kind of a romance story in a degree, to a sense. The original Dracula, even with Bela Lugosi, and then when you look at like Bram Stoker's Dracula that was done in the late '80s, early '90s, another again, just kind of a guy falling in love, right? So there was a romantic element to the original Dracula, but romantic vampires kind of became a thing with Twilight. But I feel like Anne Rice reimagined the passionate vampire. And while the Interview with the Vampire was a decent movie with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, the books were a hell of a lot better. Right. So
right.
the whole Twilight emo romance thing between Edward and what's her face, that stretched on for way too many movies for way too long, was a dark time in cinemas for mature adults. If you were a tween or a teen or an early 20s, you ate that crap up. But for sophisticated taste, that wasn't for my palate. So
Right. Well, I'm of the mind, I like certain things that are considered to be quote unquote sophisticated. I also like a lot of lowbrow things. So,
sure.
I try not to put things in that box.
Right.
But yeah, but just to answer the question overall, it's like horror is considered, it's genre entertainment, and it's considered one of those things that's sort of lowbrow or lowest common denominator as a whole. It's not everybody thinks that way, but there are enough people who think that way that it gets sort of left out of the conversation when it comes to these award shows. But I think that's slowly changing with what they now call elevated horror. Movies like Heredity, movies like, I'm trying to think of another example, but Heredity is the main example. These horror films that are a bit more of the prestige variety, and they're not as blatant with gore and violence and jump scares, and they operate more on a psychological playing field. And there's a lot of you know filmmaking that's more geared to what critics like and what the Academy may like.
Okay. I've only got three more that were on my list, and between what you've mentioned and what we already mentioned, I'll just mention three more movies that were made my rounded out my list. But Alien, 1979, was a horror movie in space,
Yes.
and again shared many common themes with the Terminator, with Michael Myers, with Jason Voorhees. This was basically a silent killer that had one mission to kill. Well, in case of the Terminator, really only to kill one person, but basically to kill. They were an unstoppable killing machine. There was a lot of suspense. Alien was absolutely a horror film in space, and the suspense. The only thing better than the suspense and the build were the kind of some of the climax payoffs where you saw the alien actually bust out and kill somebody. So the violence was the icing on the cake.
Yes, sir. Yes, definitely. And again, Alien is another movie that really only has maybe one or two scenes that are explicitly gory. So it's another one of those movies that kind of it's more subtle than you remember it.
Okay, actually, I had a few more because my notepad had not scrolled all the way back. But Alien is there. We have to give an homage to Night of the Living Dead from
Yes.
1968, right? So that one kind of, although there were zombie movies going back even to the 1930s, it was mostly like voodoo zombie stuff where it was very mystical. But the idea of what we now know as the Walking Dead, but just a plague of a zombie apocalypse. And, so the Night of the Living Dead, we definitely have to say, is a classic horror film. I think we mentioned this in passing, but we'll go ahead and say it officially. But The Thing, 1982 from John Carpenter, again, sci-fi horror. Great movie. That's actually a remake of one from the 50s, I think. I believe this was also mentioned in the live chat, but The Howling was a really good werewolf movie. Another different take on werewolf stuff, 1981. I think there was at least one more sequel to that as well. But I remember the end of the original Howling, where the woman's like a newscaster and she's talking and she busts out full werewolf on the news. I thought that was kind of cool. That was a neat way to kind of end that movie. Um, a classic, Vincent Price, 1953, House of Wax. That was scary AF
Yes.
back in the day. The wax museum and just taking real live people and turning them into wax. And that part where she's looking at the wax statue, she's like, "Oh my god, that looks like so and so." And then she like moves the wig and she can see the other person's hair underneath it. Where it's like, "Oh my god, you actually took a literal person and encased them in wax." Also, getting to director you mentioned before, but Steven Spielberg and Poltergeist made my list. Poltergeist had a great. Yeah, we did mention Close Encounters. Lola J is asking. Scott mentioned that a lot of his stuff from Steven Spielberg were favorites of his, so we did mention that. We did not mention Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that's definitely should get an honorable mention. The last one I had on my list was Stephen King's Pet Cemetery. I thought that was pretty good too. Had some good suspense.
Yeah,
So
the original 1989 version. I didn't really care for the remake all that much.
no, the original one, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And again, not having read many or most or all of Stephen King's books, I can only say I liked the movies. I can't really compare the movie to the book, but my exposure to Stephen King growing up was all through Stephen King movies. So Pet Cemetery had a decent amount of fear factor to it.
Right. Agreed. Agreed. Very
And
much.
let's just go through some of the people in the live chat, some of the questions. Phantom 8 Bitter says the Omega Man is one that he would like. Alien, yep. Lola J says Alien had me terrified, still scared. Um, Lola J says I see Dracula as dark versus horror. Phantom 8 Bitter says Twilight reinvigorated the suck in vampire movies. Putting
Yeah.
the suck in vampires.
Yeah. Well, I think with Twilight, if you were already an adult when the Twilight films came out, I think it's kind of a little unfair
You
to
weren't the
really.
demographic.
Yeah, you weren't. That was
Yes.
one aimed at you.
Yes. Unless you were filled with burning loins of teenage angst, you weren't the target audience for that movie. So, Pet Cemetery was great. Carrie was great. Christine with the car was pretty cool too, right? Where the car kept killing people for him. There's just so many good ones, but I will admit that I haven't seen a lot of modern horror. just because I think my tastes have changed, and from the ones I've seen, they just don't agree with me. Kind of like music and television and movies. Sometimes there's something that was lost on things that were done through the 80s that just aren't here. But I would say a good newer one that I did see was one that was called Hostel. Did you ever see Hostel? And I think they made a couple of those,
Yeah,
right?
I saw Hostel, and that's one of the ones. I mean, I can take a bit of gore, but that one I felt was mean spirited in a way that sort of diminished the entertainment value of it for me.
Gotcha. And what about something like the Human Centipede? Is that your cup of tea at all?
No, no, that's and keep in mind you're talking to a guy, for any of our listeners who have been watching The Gangs of London season 2. I can watch that kind of stuff. Like, so gore doesn't necessarily bother me, but for me, one of the lines that I don't like to cross is when things seem a bit too mean spirited,
Okay.
where we're just sort of pushing the envelope just to see how far we can go, and the movie becomes like an endurance test. Like, that's not really my speed for the most part. But there are gore films that I do like.
This comment is definitely worth highlighting here. Um, where did it go? Lola J says, I consider Sharknado to be a horror film.
Like, well, yeah, if you went in there expecting a decent film, I think, yeah, that would be pretty horrific.
That's just good comedy right there. Phantom 8-Bitter says suspense works so much better. Yeah, gore is about shock value. I wish these things, I can't click on things because they're scrolling so fast. But yeah, Phantom 8-Bitter says suspense works so much better. And by the way, that's a friend of mine, James D. Shout out to James D, who's out there watching us live right now. Lola J, thank you for being here. Now, this was fun since it's almost Halloween. This was your idea, Scott, to talk about this today. Luis Reyes was out there earlier too. Hey, Luis Reyes and Lola J.
And shout out to Zach Grills. He actually contacted me via Facebook Messenger about kind of maybe coming on the show, because you had suggested that the last
Yeah,
episode.
yeah.
So we gotta get with him and set a time where he'd be able and we'd be able.
Absolutely. And so I'm glad that we've had a few people join us live. We typically have not been live streaming this. We have been recording these sessions and just churning them out as podcasts. So we are. I designed this show to be a podcast only because I've done so much live content in so many other ways. I didn't want to just do another live show because it just would feel derivative of everything else I've done. So I wanted to do a show that you could just kind of listen to in your car. So we are now on episode 22 of Culture Goes Pop. This is a show Scott and I kind of just came up with together based on conversations we had as we were driving around working together, just fun, geeky things that we talked about. And I said, you know what, we should turn this into a show. We should take these conversations we're having and let's make a show. Let's make a podcast. And I intentionally wanted to do a podcast just so you could just listen, hopefully enjoy, and get about your life. So for those of you who may be tuning in live for the first time, I would invite you to check out our podcast. We've got 21 other episodes you can listen to wherever you find podcasts. You can find us. It's Culture Goes Pop. So we are on Anchor FM and Spotify and Apple and iTunes, you name it. So if you go to the website, culturegoespop.com, it's got all of our episodes. Again, this is episode 22. We're getting close to episode 25. I was thinking we should do something special for episode 25. And maybe that would be having kind of a roundtable from some of our listeners who want to join us and have a nice group discussion about anything geeky, right? So
sure. That'll be great.
And so Phantom 8-Bitter also says, scroll back through the comments and look up some of the other movies you haven't seen before for a follow-up. That's a good subject for that. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, I would definitely say, and it's funny, my name says Scott Wilson at the same time yours does. Let's fix that. The fun of doing it live. So usually when Scott and I do this off the air, we can fix all of our boo-boos. Anyways, yeah, so visit us on the web, culturegoespop.com. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, we're on Twitch. We got a Twitter, which I never use. We got a Instagram I never use because I'm too old for that crap. But I do have a Facebook group. If you're not if you're too young to use Facebook, I'm sorry, but if you're on Facebook, that's probably the single best way to interact with us real time. Facebook.com/Culture Goes Pop. Thanks for this great idea, Scott Wilson, to talk about the movies that scared us. Thank you all who've been watching us live. Anything you want to say in closing, Scott?
Anything I want to say in closing? Watch, if you haven't done so already, watch a horror film tonight or tomorrow night. Make sure it's something you can have fun with and not something that's going to seriously keep you awake.
Right.
Or unless that's fun for you.
And I would just say, for those of you who do celebrate Halloween, if you're able to put on a costume and go out and have fun regardless of your age, then please do that. Please enjoy the spirit of Halloween season. If you can't go out and if you've got kids in your neighborhood, then bring some candy for the kids, because I have kids, and nothing is worse than walking your kids through the neighborhood to some broke-ass welfare sons of bitches that don't have any candy out for the kids. It's like, come on, dude. It's once a year. Grab some freaking candy. If you're too lazy to hand it out, put the bowl on your front porch and do something, bitches. So if you can't dress up, buy a bag of candy and feed the damn kids, because damn it, it's not very often they can do something where they can have fun. So that's all I'm going to say, is enjoy the spirit of Halloween to the best of your ability.
Same here. I got some bags of candy. I'm going to be home, later in the day after work, but hopefully a few kids will stop by.
There you go. And if you want to join us on a future episode, reach out to us in all the aforementioned ways. You can reach us at show@culturegoespop.com via email. You can see us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email. I don't know. Are we on Christian Mingle or JDate? I don't think so. But we are in a few different places where you can reach out to us if you'd like to join the panel and talk about something. Love to hear from you. I'd love to get some more feedback that we can mention on the air from listener and viewer feedback. Let's put a fork in this. Are we done, Scott?
Yes, we are.
All right. Happy Halloween, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next week on episode 23, I think it is, right?
Happy Halloween.
Bye-bye.